Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lunch Break Science. I'm Ariel Johnson from the Leakey Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting human evolution research and sharing discoveries in programs like this. We'd like to thank Ann and Gordon Getty and Camilla and George Smith, whose generous support made this episode of Lunch Break Science possible. Here with us today are Leakey Foundation Gordon Getty grant recipient Margaret Crofoot and Leakey Foundation grant recipient Grace Davis. Thank you both so much for being here with us today.
It's great to be here, Ariel. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Meg and Grace are joining us from Konstanz in Germany, where they are conducting research in the Department for the Ecology of Animal Studies in the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. And they will be talking to us today about decision-making and leadership in primate societies on Barrow, Colorado Island. That's BCI, it's known in the science community, which is in Panama. There's all the way over in Panama. Before we hear from Meg and Grace, for those of you watching live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or Leakey Foundation Live, you can post questions for Meg and Grace anytime during the episode, and they'll be answering those questions at the very end. The sooner you get those questions in, the more likely they will be able to answer live today during the episode. This is the very first time we are actually featuring two scientists on Lunch Break Science, which is, I think, kind of fun. So my first question for you is, how did you begin working together?
Yeah, so I started to work with Meg about 7 years ago now. I reached out to her when I was applying to grad school. And I was really interested in social behavior and primate behavior and ecology. And she was recommended to me by several colleagues of mine that said, you know, your research interests align really well with Meg Crofoot. Reach out to her. And she was at UC Davis in California at the time and reached out, applied, got accepted. And I was actually Meg's first PhD student in California. And now we both live in Germany and moved here last year.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I was a first year tenure track professor at UC Davis and trying to get my lab started. And I got this really enthusiastic email from a student who just had this really kind of clear vision of what she wanted to do, and it matched so well with mine. And so it was a really fun, it's been a really fun trip with Grace so far, from California to Panama, and now we've moved across the world together.
So the one thing I really love hearing about and getting to talk to so many scientists is just how just reaching out to somebody, you know, that you admire or whose work you're interested in can, you know, result in these amazing opportunities. So again, I'm just really excited to have you both here discussing your research. The grants you both received from the Leakey Foundation were for your work on BCI. Why is it such a unique location to do research?
Well, BCI is this island that is located right in the middle of the Panama Canal. It actually used to be a mountaintop that became an island when they dammed the Chagres River to create this lake and connect the seas from the Caribbean to the Pacific. And kind of what makes BCI most unique is the fact that it's probably the best studied parcel of tropical forest anywhere in the world. It's the home of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and there's been a functionally continuous scientific presence there for over 100 years now. So part of what I find so exciting about working there is just the diversity of kinds of knowledge that we have about this system. There are scientists at this site. It's a really diverse scientific community, both in terms of where people are from, but also in terms of what they're doing. And so we have such a rich understanding, I guess is how I'd describe it, of this forest. So this is a picture, what you're seeing now is a picture of BCI with this lush sort of tropical canopy. And if you can imagine, there's a 50-hectare parcel right in the middle of the island where every single tree has been identified and is measured every 5 years. So we know just a tremendous amount and a tremendous detail about this ecosystem.
What are some of the species you're looking at there?
Yeah, so we're mostly focused on the primates there for these studies with the Leakey Foundation, and two species that we're working on. One are white-faced capuchins and the other are blackhanded spiked black-handed spider monkeys. Both are fruit-eating monkeys that live in the tropical forests of the Americas and live on BCI. They're native to that island. These are the guys that have those long prehensile tails that can wrap around branches. They mostly eat fruit. They live in highly social big groups. And what's really interesting about these species is they're a great comparison in a lot of ways because they're living in some of the same areas. They're living on this, the same island, foraging on some of the same fruits, moving across some of the same parts of the island, maybe have similar predators, similar competitors, but they're different in a lot of ways too. And that those differences that we're mostly interested in are social differences. And so one of which we have been really interested in for these studies is looking at differences in their grouping patterns, and so who they're spending time with whom. And Capuchin monkeys tend to live in these stable social groups that are very cohesive, meaning that they're staying together with each other in these small groups all day, every day for most of their lives. And they're making decisions together, they're traveling together. And spider monkeys, on the other hand, there's one community on the island that we study. There's probably about 55 or so spider monkeys on the island. And that community, I actually rarely see them together when I'm out in the field. I rarely see all 55 of them in one spot. And they tend to be, it's very fluid. So you see smaller groups of 5 individuals that will then merge back into a group of 20 individuals. And this fluid society we call fission-fusion, social grouping patterns. It's actually the same kind of grouping that humans do. And so this makes that a really interesting comparison, differences in social grouping patterns. And the other thing that's really interesting about these two species that we're interested in comparing is their hierarchical structure. So Capuchin monkeys live, these small groups, they have a pretty strict dominance hierarchy. So you've got alpha individuals that are dominant to beta individuals, all the way down the line to subordinate individuals. And then spider monkeys are different from that. They're in a society that we call egalitarian, which means that most individuals are relatively equal in rank. There's not strict dominance where there's ones that are constantly dominating other individuals. So these are really interesting comparisons for us for these species.
Why are they such ideal species to look at when you're looking at questions on leadership and decision making?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of these ideas really came about around the thought about how do groups reach consensus? How do they reach, a group decision and consensus about where they're going and what they're doing and when they're doing it? And these species make a really interesting comparison for this because of, one, the power asymmetries between individuals. So Capuchin monkeys having that dominance hierarchy, maybe some individuals can monopolize decisions, be a leader. And then spider monkeys having this fluid fission-fusion social grouping where individuals could split off from each other if they have conflicts, if they don't want to do what their friend is doing. And then there's also this interesting, flexibility in social grouping that relates to consensus. Like Capuchin monkeys, they're staying together all day, every day. So they have to come to consensus about where they're going to go and when they're going to do certain activities, how long they're going to spend in a foraging tree. And then spider monkeys, they potentially don't. So when a conflict arises, one individual wants to go one way, one wants to go the other, spider monkeys could potentially split off. And so this is really interesting for decision-making and leadership for us.
Yeah. And our work really is focused on these questions about how leadership emerges in the societies, which I think are kind of universal questions in a lot of ways. I mean, as humans, we're constantly having to figure out how to negotiate differing opinions and conflicts of interest and reach consensus about where to go and what to do. Anyone who's ever had to make a decision about a restaurant with a whole group of friends knows how challenging that can be.
Oh, absolutely.
But part of what I think is really interesting about thinking about these questions in non-human species, and part of why I think it's important to have these connections between research on human primates and non-human primates, is because I think it's easier to see the ways in which we potentially are anthropomorphizing our thoughts about these things. So leadership is this very easy concept to anthropomorphize, and we think of leading as being something intentional, something that you do by choice and that you perhaps invest effort in. But when you're thinking about animal societies, and this is probably true for for ourselves as well, there are a whole bunch of ways in which leadership can emerge through completely unintentional processes. It's not necessarily that leaders want to lead. It may be simply that leaders are followed. You become a leader by being followed.
Your research, it really uses, for both of you, you use a really multidisciplinary approach in tackling these questions. What are your methods?
Yeah, I think especially for studying leadership and decision-making with these monkeys, the heart of really what we're doing is detailed behavioral observations on the ground in Panama. So tracking the animals in multiple groups of both species and studying their behavior. And we tend to focus these studies on particular times of year and particular food items that are, keystone or really important resources for the monkeys during this time of year. And this provides us a really good global overview of, the environment and where food resources are. I'll let Meg talk a little bit about that. And also, where these animals are going. And so we'll be on the ground. I've spent a number of months in Panama on the ground with a field team of researchers there, tracking these monkeys, recording, foraging behavior and leadership. So when monkeys are moving from one place to the next, which monkeys are in front? How are they moving from place to place? And we'll talk more about that later in this episode too. But yeah, a lot of it is really focused on this detailed behavioral observations in real time.
But part of what is fun about working on BCI for this particular project is also the opportunities that it affords to complement these really rich behavioral data that you can only get by watching monkeys with sort of other perspectives on the world that they're living in. So we use drones, for example, to map the entire island and create this sort of comprehensive map of where all the possible food trees they could eat in are. So what you're seeing here is it's actually a three-dimensional surface that represents the island's topography, but where we're also able to outline every single tree crown of this species, Dipteryx oleifera, which produces, big fruits that both monkey species really, really like and focus on intensively during particular times of year. The other kind of exciting thing that we're able to incorporate, and which both facilitates the behavioral work we do by making it easier to find the monkeys, which, when you wake up really early in the morning, it's really nice to be able to have some help figuring out where the monkeys are. So we use both radio collars and GPS collars to track the movements of many of our study groups. So with GPS collars, we can actually track simultaneously. What you're seeing here is the movements of 5 Capuchin groups and then several spider monkeys. The spider monkeys are the reddy orange color, and the rest are all Capuchins. And one thing you might notice is the Capuchins range in these relatively discrete home ranges. If you want to find a Capuchin, it can be work, but you sort of know where to look. In contrast, the spider monkeys range over this entire island. And so we are able to gain a really much more detailed insight into the areas the monkeys are using and how they're interacting with one another.
That is so fascinating. Before we jump into your talk, though, I know that there is this one concept that is really important to understanding all of your research, which is the marginal value theorem. That's correct, right?
Yeah.
You got it right.
Okay, good. So could you tell me what the marginal value theorem is?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually share my screen with you guys so that I can show you a little bit more about what the marginal value theorem is. Let's see. All right, can you all see this figure of a palm tree?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. Okay, so imagine, for instance, that you are a monkey foraging in a palm tree. This is a pretty important resource for the Capuchin monkeys that we study and some of the spider monkeys as well, which we'll talk about a little later on. But imagine you get there, you're just one monkey, you arrive in this tree, and when you arrive, there's a lot of fruit available. And so you start eating this fruit. And I'm going to show you the graphical representation of the marginal value theorem and explain it as I go. And, you arrive in this tree and you start eating the fruit. And initially, the fruits are all right there in front of you. They're easy to find. You can eat pretty quickly. It's easy to find another fruit. But as you're eating, you start to eat all the fruits. You start to deplete the tree. It gets harder and harder for you to find another ripe fruit as you are consuming in this tree. And so this is a graphical representation of that, where it's called the gain curve function in the marginal value theorem. And it essentially means that as time goes on, that an animal is spending in a resource patch like a fruit tree, it gets harder and harder to find fruit. And you can look at that by calculating the cumulative energy intake, or the number of fruits that a monkey's eating over time. And that's that curve that you see on the screen. Now, at some point, it's better for you to move on to another tree. So at some point, it gets way too hard to find the next fruit. And you would do better off just moving to the next palm tree where there's a lot of ripe fruit available that you haven't depleted yet. And the marginal value theorem is a way for us to predict that time of leaving, that time that you should move on. And the way that it's predicted is based on how far apart resources are, so how long it's going to take you to get to the next tree. And this is just the graphical representation of that prediction time. And I want you to think of it as this is the preferred time of when that monkey wants to leave that tree. And it's just represented here as a vertical dashed line. So we call this in the marginal value theorem the optimal departure time. This is the optimal time for that monkey to leave the tree when it's better to go off and find a new food resource.
Thank you so much. I think that'll definitely has primed all of us for your talk. Before I turn the virtual floor over to you both, I'm going to remind everybody watching us live, if you've got questions, be sure to get those into the chat. You can submit them anytime, in the middle of the lecture, and then they will answer, or at the end, whenever you want. They'll answer them at the end of the episode. So now I will turn the virtual floor over to you both, and you can take it away from here.
Yeah. Give me a second. I will share my screen again, and we will give you more information about this study. Okay.
It's really neat to hear about all of the different, data points you're collecting. And it's got to be such a dream to work in a spot where you've got data on so many different aspects of where you're working.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Also really sweaty and lots of ticks.
Yeah, it is a tropical rainforest.
Okay, now I will turn the virtual floor over to you.
Thanks, Ariel. Thanks, Grace, for getting that up. So what both Grace and I are interested in this particular system and for these projects that the Leakey Foundation has supported us with was trying to understand how groups of animals reach consensus, even when the members of the group may have conflicting preferences. And so one of the things about most primate groups, maybe all primate groups actually, is that their membership is quite diverse. So what you're seeing here in the center is one of these palm fronds. It's an Atalaya palm, and you've got two little kind of young capuchins hanging out on the palm together, eating fruit, picking fruit, having a grand old time. And on the right is a big male, and that big male is maybe twice as big as these small guys. Mm-hmm. And he's also socially dominant to them, so he can displace them. You'll notice that there actually is one other capuchin on that palm front. Kind of, you can just see his tail curling around the back. But for the most part, when an adult male is eating, he's able to monopolize the entire food patch if he wants to. And so what this means is that the interests, there's significant power asymmetries in the group, and the interests of a big adult male don't necessarily align perfectly with the interests of a small juvenile. Similarly, if you're a female Capuchin, an older female Capuchin, which is what you're seeing in sort of this left picture, that's Mimi, one of the oldest females in our study system, and she's sort of perched up there on top of an Atalaya palm. You know, she's got things figured out. She's had a lot of years of life to live. She's had a lot of time to figure out the best way to open up these palm fruits. Do it quickly, do it efficiently, get as much pulp as she can, and then sort of move on to the next one. She's really got this figured out. In contrast, those little guys, they have trouble. They have to search a lot. They pick a fruit. It smells bad. They drop it. They pick another fruit. They take a while to open it up because it's got this cask that they have to peel off. They taste it. It tastes disgusting. They drop it, or it's too slippery and they drop it by accident. They're just not very good at it. And so what all this variation, whether it's age-related variation, sex-related variation, size-related variation means is that the interests of all of these group members are potentially in conflict with one another. However, they still have to figure out some way of deciding together when it's time to move on from this tree to the next. And so Grace is going to tell you a little bit more about the ways in which we're using the marginal value theorem as a way of assessing these conflicts of interest, quantifying them. So Grace, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah. Okay, so like I was showing you all a little earlier about the marginal value theorem, these models have largely been thought of for just a single animal. So just a single animal that's feeding in a fruit tree, like a palm, one monkey and a palm. And again, just to reiterate, it is looking at that optimal departure time. When should that monkey be preferred or want to leave a palm based on their foraging intake rate in that tree? When should they go on to the next tree? Well, what happens in Capuchin monkeys, because they live in groups, they're not really solitary. What happens when they're living in groups and there's multiple individuals that enter into these trees and feed? And so this figure, let's just imagine for simplicity, there's just two Capuchin monkeys. Maybe let's think of it like an adult and a juvenile Capuchin monkey. And like Meg was saying, the little monkeys have trouble feeding. So you can imagine that the little monkey, we'll say, is individual B. That's the smaller one. And they have a hard time finding food. Maybe it takes a lot of learning for these guys to find a ripe fruit and be able to process it well. And so their foraging intake rate goes slower. They're taking longer to find food. And so you'll see that their gain curve, the green gain curve for individual B, it slopes slower. So it's taking them longer and longer to find ripe fruit and eat it than the adult individual. And well, what if there's even more individuals in the group? Say, let's introduce a third individual. And like Meg was talking about, there's a lot of differences between group members. And, there's differences like adults and juveniles, but there's also differences like dominants and subordinates and Capuchin monkeys. So maybe let's imagine that our third individual C is a subordinate monkey. And dominant monkeys, because these palm trees have that big fruit clump that's really condensed, all the food is in one tiny spot, and it suspends off this single stem of the plant. So you can get dominant individuals that will climb down and displace other individuals on that fruit clump. And so maybe that dominant individual A is getting access to better or more of the fruit clump. They can pick off ripe fruits faster. Their feeding rate is much quicker than individuals B, who's struggling, still learning how to forage, and individual C, who just is out of luck and can't really get to good parts of the patch or beyond the patch even for very long. And so this introduces those differences in those foraging intake rates. So those curves are very different shapes, right? And that then will translate into this conflict of interest between individuals over when to leave. So a conflict over how long do they want to spend in that tree before they move on to the next tree. And that's just graphically represented here as those vertical dashed lines. So you'll see that individual A wants to leave, maybe at 18 minutes, that vertical white dashed line, while individual B, wants to stay for almost 30 minutes. So what does the group do, and how does the group come to consensus over when to leave these trees? And that's really central to the projects that we're doing here.
So when you're thinking about decision-making, how groups decide where to go and what to do, you can think of the mechanisms, the processes they use as sort of lying on a continuum from completely shared at one end, where all individuals have equal say. This is like kind of like a straight up majority rule, everybody has equal influence situation, through a variety of sort of intermediary types of partially shared decision making, where maybe some individuals have outsized influence, but it's not complete, or some individuals lead in some cases, but not in all cases, all the way to the far end of the spectrum, where you have fully unshared decision-making. A single despotic leader decides for the entire group. And one of the things that we're able to do with the kinds of predictions that Grace just explained, stemming from the marginal value theorem, is to make predictions about which of these types of decision-making processes are being used. Because we can quantify the conflicts of interest, we can basically see, Grace, I'm going to ask you to pop up. Thank you. We can make predictions. So we would expect, if the group is making an equally shared decision, that the departure time, the observed departure time of the group, so when we're sitting there in the forest under this tree watching when the entire group actually leaves and goes on from the patch that it's in to find its next tree, in an equally shared decision, the group should leave at the average of the preferred times for all individuals in the group. So basically, they compromise. Everybody gives up a little bit, and they go sort of at this intermediate time period. In contrast, if what's going on is a much more despotic thing, where a despotic process where a single group leader is deciding for everybody, what we expect to see is that the observed group departure time is going to really align nicely with the preferences of perhaps the dominant male, perhaps the dominant female, whoever that decider, that decision-making individual is, that leader.
All right, so I'm going to now describe to you guys a little bit about the way that we collect data in the field for the marginal value theorem to generate those foraging gain curves. And there's a video that hopefully Ariel can pop up for you all. Let me know if you can see it.
It's up, Grace.
Great.
Grace can't see the video.
I can't see the video. Glad all of you can. Yeah, so, like I said, the biggest and most important method for this study are detailed behavioral observations in the field. And we focused this study across 2 years during the summer months from June through August, when the Capuchin monkeys are feeding on these Atalaya palm trees. And this is a really important resource. They actually spend about 80% of their total time feeding is feeding in these palms. So they're, really, this is a really important high caloric value resource for these guys during this time. And again, that palm fruit clumps off the single stem. And the great thing about this is not only does it create this really interesting, social dynamics and competition and differences in foraging intake, but it also really allows us to observe the monkeys and collect really high resolution behavioral data on their foraging behavior. So we can stand, myself and a number of field assistants can stand underneath these trees, see the whole clump, and record the times that every single monkey in the group enters the clump of fruit, the time that they enter, and then the amount of food that they're extracting. So the time that any individual removes fruit from the clump, and how much fruit each monkey is eating. And we can use those foraging intake rates for each individual to generate those intake gain curves for the marginal value theorem that then predict those optimal preferred departure times for different individuals. Then the other thing that is important that we do in these observations of these Atalaya trees, so when the groups are in there, we record entry times, feeding intake rates, but we also record when the group is moving on. So we will record both initiation attempts from individuals. So an initiation is an individual that's moving away, exits the tree, moves away, attempts to get the group to follow it. And then we record, how many followers will follow that monkey and the timing of group departure. So when the group actually moves on from one tree to the next. And because Capuchin monkeys are in these cohesive groups staying together, they're going to move on at a time cohesively together and come to some sort of consensus about, okay, when to go. So we also will record those observations in the field as well. Okay. Can you see my screen again?
We can see a green slide, but it doesn't have anything
Perfect.
on it.
Okay. Okay. So I'm now going to show you some results from this study. And one of the most important results initially is that we do see that there are conflicts over when to go across group members. So this is a figure of just one palm tree where we collected intake rates for all individuals in a Capuchin monkey group that fed in that palm tree. And actually each little colored point on this graph is a feeding observation of an Atalaya fruit in real time. And then we fit gain curves to each intake rate for each individual. So those different colored curves are different intake rates of different individuals. And if you take out the feeding observations and just look at the optimal departure times, which are those, vertical dashed lines drawn from how long it takes to get from tree to tree, or the travel time, you'll see that there is a lot of conflict between individuals. So some individuals want to leave around 7 minutes, while there's one individual that wants to leave around, 45 minutes from that tree. So there's a lot of conflict over, when is this group going to leave? And we see that across palm trees, which is really interesting. And then the other thing that we have noticed, so like I was talking about, is we record those initiation attempts of individuals when they're moving away from one palm and going to the next one. And a traditional way that a lot of studies measure influence or leadership is looking at who is in front of groups or who moves first. And if we do this, if we take our data and look at leadership and influence in this way, we find that the alpha females tend to be the ones that are leading the most. They tend to be the ones that initiate the most and are in front of the group when the group is moving from one tree and on to the next. So this top graph, if you look at it, this is the number of times a monkey made an initiation movement away from a tree, the number of times that monkey left the tree to go on, to move away. And the successful initiations, so the ones, that means that the monkey was able to get the rest of the group to follow it, are colored in blue, and unsuccessful are colored in red. So the group did not follow that monkey. So the higher the blue part of that bar, the more successful that monkey was. And you'll see not every monkey is always successful. All monkeys try and move away, make initiation attempts, but the alpha female, so the second bar with that really tall blue part, she's the one that's making both the most number of initiations and she's the most successful. So over 2/3 of the time, the group was following the alpha female if we just look at initiations. And the lower graph is showing the departure order. So if you are departure order number 1, you're the first monkey to leave when the group is moving on and the group follows you. So again, you'll see that that alpha female is really low on the departure order. It looks like the group is following her. So this is if we just look at that traditional way of measuring influence based on who's in front and who's making initiation attempts. But if we take a look at our foraging data and based on the marginal value theorem, the results look a little bit different. And so we see that, more than 2/3 of the time, the group is leaving really, really close to an average optimal departure time for all. So if you're looking across, remember those vertical dashed lines, those average or those optimal departure times for individuals, the group tends to leave at an average across those. And we see that for 70% of trees. And this is really indicating to us that more of a shared decision-making process when compared to, you know, just an alpha female that's making most decisions. And so this is really interesting for us to, you know, think about that, you know, different ways of looking at leadership can lead to these different decision processes.
So what have we learned so far, and where do we want to go? Well, from combining sort of this kind of direct, intensive observation with the sort of large-scale mapping of resources and the incorporation of kind of exciting new technologies that give us new windows. I think what's most exciting about where we are so far in terms of trying to answer our questions is the kind of profound realization that our questions were too simple to begin with. Kind of the way this gets talked about is like, is a species despotic or egalitarian? And I think what our results are really showing, as Grace sort of told you, decisions about where to go on the landscape look like they're being made in a relatively top-down manner. The alpha female is having a big influence over the direction of group travel. But in contrast, the question of timing really is a much more shared decision, much more egalitarian, that is taking into account the preferences of many, many more group members. So, I mean, to me, what this suggests is that when we frame the question as, is a species despotic or are they egalitarian, we're really asking kind of the wrong question and maybe the less interesting the question. To me, where we're sort of starting to dig into this more and where I think I see tremendous potential for understanding the complexities of the way that group dynamics shape the kinds of decisions that a species makes, is digging into under what context they choose one decision-making process or another, and how that emerges from these individual behavioral decisions. So I think, you know, stepping back, this combination of theory, direct observation, and remote sensing technology, I think has a lot of promise for allowing us to dig into the societies of a wide number of primate species, and really start to understand why and when groups decide and reach consensus in particular ways.
Yeah, so one of the other projects that was supported by the Leakey Foundation that we want to talk to you about is looking at leadership and influence and how this can be affected by physiological state of individuals. And the real basic hypothesis for this that we had is that individuals with high need, like a hungry monkey, for instance, a monkey that's, you know, really needs to eat, will be out in front because they're motivated to find the resources, find food resources to satiate their hunger. And then, you know, they'll be followed by close social partners. So these monkeys that are hungry will lead according to their need and be followed as a result. And, you know, spider monkeys present a really interesting system for this because they're fission fusion. And so we can look at what happens when there's high conflict between individuals over, you know, both when to go, like this marginal value theorem project, but also in their need. So if there's, you know, one individual has a really high need and one has a really low need, perhaps they will split off and do different things. So this is something that we're also testing. And then the other piece of this project is that we are collecting, you know, samples in the field that can indicate for us what need is for these monkeys. So it's really hard to ask a monkey what it needs. And so we have been, you know, developing methods to assess need. And one of those is through urine samples. And we use biomarkers of energy balance in the urine from spider monkeys that assess need. And then another way that we're doing this is through foraging intake rates and then collecting fruit that the monkeys ate and then analyzing it for nutritional content. And so this is another way that we are extending our research on leadership and decision-making to look at, you know, not just how dominance or, you know, differences in foraging behavior influence, you know, who has influence, but also how physiological status and the internal physiology of an animal might also influence their decision-making processes and leadership. And so with that, that's just a broad overview of our research. And I'll stop sharing this.
And we're excited to answer your questions.
I think you're muted, Aria.
Yeah, I can't hear you, Ariel.
This is better, I'm assuming.
Yes.
So yes, it is question time. If you're watching live, get those questions into the chat right now. I have an initial question for the two of you. During these times, we're, really having decision-making and leadership on our minds. What is it that we can learn about human decision-making and leadership from spider monkeys and capuchins?
Well, I can have a first go at this and then I'll throw the ball to Grace. But I mean, to me, when I think about what makes humans such an unusual ape, what makes us stand out from the other animal species on the planet, it's really the degree to which we sort of have created this specialized ecological niche that focuses on our collective ecology, the ways in which we as a group, we have these collective behaviors, collective traits, whether we're talking about language that promotes shared meaning, like us being able to have this conversation and understand each other, or whether we're talking about the cumulative nature of our culture. We're a species that's like defined by the things we do together as a group. And a big part of being able to do that is the ability to overcome conflicts of interest and reach consensus. And so I think understanding the barriers to consensus, as well as the pathways to consensus, is part of where I think this research is really becoming interesting and exciting. And Grace, I'll hand over to you now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the great things about studying primates in the field is that we, get to study these animals in their natural habitats, and, human behavior didn't leave really much of a fossil record. We just have the bones, the artifacts that are left behind. And so we can use primates as kind of a model system to infer, maybe this is what it was like when leadership evolved. And, leadership is ubiquitous in human societies. You see it everywhere, all the way from hunter-gatherers all the way up to, our societies, today. And there's been hypotheses about, maybe leadership arose to solve, coordination problems in a society. To, one individual will, initiate some, idea or a direction of where to go, and, then gets followed by others. And I think these are things that we can look at a basic level in primates, and then, infer, what does this tell us about our evolutionary history as well?
Well, thank you. Now we will take our first question from the audience. Do these species ever interact? Do they occupy same trees to feed?
Yeah,
take that one, Grace.
Yeah, these species do interact, and because one of the great things about working on this island is that we can study them at the same time of year when they're feeding on the same food resources, and so we do see them interact fairly often. I would say, fairly often. I see it at least multiple times a week, actually, when I'm conducting behavioral observations. And it usually doesn't go very well for one or the other. It's not usually a friendly interaction. I've actually seen a spider monkey pull a baby, it was a baby howler monkey, but a different species of monkey. It picked it up by its tail and swung it around and then flung it off the tree. So I've seen that, I've seen them, capuchins tend to try and threaten spider monkeys, but because they're smaller, spider monkeys kind of just come through, and, as long as there's enough spider monkeys, the capuchins kind of go off. If there's more capuchin monkeys, though, sometimes they can displace spider monkeys and take over the foraging tree. But yeah, I do see interactions between these animals.
Capuchins are pugnacious little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They'll always threaten. The spider monkeys will sometimes just ignore the capuchin monkey, but yeah.
So let's take our next question from the audience. I can see why dominance would be an evolutionary driver, but do you think the monkeys understand why they are being dominant when they are?
That's a really interesting question. And I think, I'm going to answer it in part with a story about our reluctant dominant male in this particular group. Because so the male that I showed you at the very beginning of this talk, Bravo Luis, is actually a monkey that I first started studying when I was doing the first year of my PhD in 2004. So it's been he and I have known each other a long time. And he spent the vast majority of his life, he's a big burly dude. And he spent the vast majority of his life as the number 3 male in this group. And he's big enough to have defeated every dominant alpha male that's led this group for, 16 years now. And he just didn't have the personality. He was not aggressive. He prefers to hang out by himself. And it took this mass mortality event where 50 to 70% of our population died. And pretty much there were no other males for him to become alpha male in this group. And he still doesn't act like an alpha. He still doesn't act like a dominant male. And so this question about how they perceive their dominance and how they come to be dominant, I think there are many pathways to dominance within primate groups. And not all of them are through the kinds of overt aggressive behaviors that we might associate with how you come to be the dominant guy. And so I guess, to me, I think how they perceive their own status within the group is a very kind of relevant question, but the black box of a monkey's head is still really hard to crack open. Anything you want to add, Grace?
Yeah, the black box of a monkey's head. Yeah. And I think dominance, it depends on, how we think about dominance. If we think about it as a monkey that is, constantly aggressing other monkeys, is it the monkey that's, wins all the fights and displaces other monkeys in fruit trees? Or, you could think of dominance in other ways as well. Like maybe it's an individual that is dominant in the fact that it's the first individual into foraging trees and gets access to the food right away. Maybe it's, sometimes these monkeys have fights between monkey groups. So maybe it's the ones that are the ones always willing to go out and fight, defend their territory. So I think you can also think about it in different ways.
Yeah, I think for me, part of what's been so excited about moving into this particular area of my research, of inquiry, has been this realization that influence is so multifaceted within primate communities. And we tend to focus on dominance because we can measure it and because you get these nice linear hierarchies in a lot of species. But even in really despotic, highly hierarchical species, who has influence is just, in particular contexts, is just so much more interesting than that. So.
Yeah, and the way that, we assess some of these dominance hierarchies, like the way that I was assessing dominance for looking at, how does dominance influence, who's out in front of the group and who's successfully initiating attempts away from trees, is just looking at displacements and, foraging aggression and who won that aggression event and who lost. And so, simple ways, but I think, there's more to it than that too.
Shall we take our next question? Let's see here. Curious as to whether you have observed and or would expect to see helping behaviors food sharing.
I've seen it. It's pretty rare. I actually have in my list of behaviors that I record in these palm trees, one of the behaviors is share. Out of all the other behaviors of, eat a fruit and, touch a fruit and that behavior has probably come up in, months of data collection, 10 times, maybe less. It's really rare. I've actually mostly seen it between juveniles. Like one juvenile will, kind of beg. You'll actually, see the individual kind of, make noises and hold out their hands to the other. The only other weird time that I've seen food sharing was when the Capuchin monkeys found a nest of baby squirrels and raided the nest of baby squirrels. And the dominant male was the one who got the baby squirrels first. And he was the one who picked the baby squirrels and ate them. But he didn't eat all of them. He actually shared the food, and he only shared it with the subadult males in the group, which was interesting. I had never seen a dominant male share like that before. So that was just a little natural history anecdote as well.
Yeah, I think food sharing is one of these fascinating things because we tend to see it in this really anecdotal way in these one-off things. So Mimi, that old female capuchin sitting on top of that palm frond, we have one observation of her finding a tinamou egg. It's these brilliant robin's egg blue, like super bright blue eggs the size of like a chicken egg. And she and another female sat there passing it back and forth between them. They had tapped a little hole in it and they would stick their fingers in and lick their fingers and then pass it over. And they passed it back and forth 6 times. We've seen it once, never happened again. We got all excited about this and created fake tinamou nests and, we got all excited about studying food sharing. We've never seen it again. Yeah.
So let's take our next question from the audience. Do you think you can look at the emergence of decision-making during predator encounters in a similar way as emergence of decisions about eating?
So yes. And I think that context is really interesting because it's one where I would expect there to be a really strong speed accuracy trade-off. So there's really good evidence both from theoretical models and from the empirical literature, mostly on human decision making, that the more voices you have contributing to a decision the more likely it is that you're going to get the right answer. So decisions get better with more voices participating. However, when a lion's running at you or a leopard, it may not matter that you get the perfect decision. It may just matter that you make a decision quickly. Yeah. And so it's sort of a case where we might it seems highly plausible to me that even a species, so as I've been thinking about this, Corey, I think it would be a really, really interesting thing to do in our baboon study system where we're also studying collective decision making. And my gut is that even though these baboons are making shared decision making processes in the context of movement decisions, when it comes to running away from lions and whether to go to that tree or that tree, I suspect you may see strong leadership. But not necessarily by an alpha individual.
Let's take another question from the audience. Does consensus imply awareness of others' intentions? If yes, does physical proximity or hierarchy affect the level of awareness?
Do you want me to have a go, Grace?
Yeah, have a go first. I'll think about it.
It's a good question. No, I don't think it does necessarily imply, it doesn't imply awareness of intentions at all, because you can reach, you can have consensus decision making. Consensus decision making is found across pretty much the entire tree of life. Organisms of all kinds, not just animals, but fungi as well, figure out how to make consensus decisions. And so I don't think it necessarily connotates that kind of awareness. But I think that what it takes to be good at resolving conflicts of interest, and what it takes to be effective at reaching consensus may have something to do with your ability to put yourself in the mind of another, to understand that there is a conflict in the first place. And so I think that's a really interesting, I mean, we have no data on this, so I'm totally talking from, you know, the ethers here. But I think that it is an interesting idea about how sort of social cognition either facilitates or potentiates consensus decision-making processes that wouldn't be possible without that cognition.
Yeah, and I think consensus also, like Meg said, you know, we see it in so many different systems. And I think it can also arise, you know, with monkeys, we tend to focus on, oh, individuals are so different in a group, right? Like we have, you know, group members that are adults, juveniles, dominant, subordinates, you know, more experience, less experience, older, younger. And so we tend to think, you know, individuals are really different. You know, they might have different needs. They might want to do different things. But consensus could maybe even arise if individuals are all really similar and they all just want to do the same thing. And so I think also thinking about it that way can be useful too.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Has agent-based modeling ever been used to simulate and investigate these foraging decisions?
Yeah, it has. There's actually a group at UC Davis that has used some agent-based modeling to, you know, study some parts of marginal value theorem. You know, my friend Matt Miller and Jeffrey Shank, they've looked at marginal value theorem and how agent-based modeling has informed, you know, those decision processes and, you know, how decisions arise. I think there's less that has been done about group decisions. A lot of it is mostly focused on individual decisions. So, you know, an individual decision of when to leave and foraging behavior. Group decisions, the kind of models that are out there, less agent-based ones that I know of, you know, just tend to be theoretical models. The social ones tend to just assume individuals in a group are identical. So I think that's where our research is, you know, taking this to a different level of, okay, individuals are different, you know, what happens and how are decisions, you know, how are decisions made?
And I think it also sort of, I think we're sitting at, well, what I hope is the edge of sort of a renaissance of theory related to social foraging decisions. Optimal foraging theory has been around and has been a tremendously useful tool for a long time that has also kind of fallen out of favor in a lot of ways. And it is imperfect. So I mean, I think if you look at, if you think back to any of the graphs that Grace showed you, it obviously doesn't perfectly capture the social dynamics. And I think there's a really unique opportunity here, particularly for species that live in these cohesive groups that are committed to consensus, to use the solid foundation of theory that exists to build and to really sort of expand the frameworks in which empirical researchers like us can ask questions. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time for this sort of area of research.
Well, it sounds really exciting. Thank you both. This was so fun having you both here on the show today. I'm just so excited to have gotten to hear about, you know, your collaboration and again, just thank you.
Oh, it was great to be here.
Thanks so much for having us, Ariel. It was really fun.
Yeah. So you can visit the Leakey Foundation at leakeyfoundation.org to learn more about us, Meg Crofoot and Grace Davis, as well as how you can help support research like theirs and educational programs like Lunch Break Science. Right now, all donations will be doubled by 2 generous donors, meaning your impact will be doubled. Next week, on October 20th, we have our first full-length lecture. Leakey Foundation scientist Dr. Gaigo Romero discusses Denisovan DNA present in present-day island Southeast Asian populations. The lecture will be live streamed on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Leakey Foundation Live. We have a special episode of Lunch Break Science on October 22nd, celebrating our friends at the Bay Area Science Festival's 10th anniversary. Leakey Foundation scientist Catherine Markham will be discussing her work on social complexity and her science activity site, Shutterbug Science. It's going to be a really great episode. If you miss an episode of Lunch Break Science, visit us at Leakey Foundation Live or the Leakey Foundation's YouTube channel to catch up on all of our past episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the Leakey Foundation's YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or sign up our newsletter to be the first to hear about upcoming episodes and events, as well as groundbreaking discoveries in human evolution research. If you're still hungry for science and can't wait until next week, check out the Leakey Foundation's award-winning podcast, Origin Stories, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Lunch Break Science is made possible by the generous support of Anne and Gordon Getty and Camilla and George Smith. Thank you all for taking a break from your day and feeding your brain with the Leakey Foundation. Until next week, stay hungry for knowledge. Bye, everyone.